Have you ever built something on Conan Exiles but wanted a completely different vibe on the interior? I think we've all been here, but without mods the ability to do so is incredibly limited. Is this actually a viable idea? Today we'll be finding out if we can make masking work. So let's get started. I've talked about this idea before, but for those unaware, masking is the practice of having a building on the inside, in this example Khitan, masked by something different on the outside, in this example pyramid. The purpose of this is to be more flexible in how you present exterior and interior design, but it does come with its own pitfalls. There are a few mods that offer this with a very elegant approach, but without mods, the main issue with masking is that it forces you to build bigger than you initially wanted to. After you've designed your interior, you then have to add another tile worth of thickness around your entire build, which can really throw off the balance. Balance and intricacy is probably one of the most important things in any Conan build, and it's pretty hard to nail it down even at the best of times. With that in mind, masking can really throw a wrench in the works, and the end result can end up pretty ugly, but we'll touch on that a bit more later. Outside of a few niche designs, I've not used masking in a long time. However, a recent comment by Groboff82 on my Thrall Outpost EBA got me thinking about if I could make masking work, and if I could find a technique that will make it easier for you guys to use. So let's start by setting up a small build here, and then we'll mask it. This is the interior space. I've used Frontier because the exterior is notoriously divisive for most, but the interior is pretty good. I've laid it out like I would a normal build, with a jutting doorway to connect to the exterior. Now let's build the mask, which will be Aquilonian. And surprisingly, it's actually turned out pretty good. The design is fairly normal on the outside, and you wouldn't really think that it's concealing a completely different interior. Now that being said, there are a couple of downsides. The first, you can't really get windows in here because of that buffer layer between the interior and the exterior, which also almost completely rules out storm glass windows, which is a big downside. The second is the entrance, as this technique almost always necessitates an entrance corridor, which I'm personally not a big fan of, but it is something of a minor downside and not really a major one. However, one of the largest downsides is indeed size scaling. Let's take this pretty standard 2-story house. If I wanted to mask this with Numidian and Flotsam for example, it ends up pretty ugly in my opinion. The build is very dense and thick, which results in a lot of plain boring walls. This creates a lot of further busy work with adding all the bells and whistles to make this build look nicer. It isn't too hard to do, but it does take a fair amount of time. Now, to be honest, with all the improvements made, the build does look much better with all the extra facade decorations, but for me, and this might just be a me thing, it still feels slightly off in terms of how thick the build is. However, with proper architectural decoration, it can definitely work even on the larger scale. You can also use the masking trick for half masks, where the lower floor is masked but the upper floors are normal. I've only used this maybe a handful of times, but I do think it's quite a charming look on some designs. So we know that masking can be done, but is it actually a useful technique? Well, before this video, I was of the opinion that it was pretty much useless because of all the extra work and the imbalance it creates in builds. However, that was an opinion I formed a few years ago when I was much worse at building. Having given it another try now, I do actually think there's a pretty good place for masking in the grand scheme of things. Now that being said, I don't recommend it for everyone, and I won't recommend it for every build. To be frank, I don't think I'll be using it all that often, but this is something that is good to have in your back pocket. However, there are a couple of core tenets that if you're going to use masking, you really should adhere to. Rule 1. Have a solid design. Much like any other build, a poor start will almost always result in a poor finish. Even with the after effects of masking, a lot of them can be lessened just by having a good design. Rule 2. Consider the size. Masking almost always necessitates an increase in size, so you will have to factor this into your plan, both in terms of your interior space and how much space the final build itself will take up, alongside any increases to width, length or height. Rule 3. Cover the weaknesses. This is especially pertinent for large builds, where big and bland stretches of wall can look pretty ugly. However, you can negate this with facade decorations, which often makes a massive improvement. Finally, rule number 4. Always build from the inside out. Construct the interior first, and then make the exterior. If you do it in reverse, you can end up with a lot of unforeseen issues in the design that generally make things feel much more cramped and inauthentic inside. To wrap things up, masking can actually work pretty well for some builds. Yes, mods do make this a lot easier, but if you don't want to use mods or if you're on console, yeah, this method's a bit fiddly, but it's viable, and with a good design, you can definitely make it work. Thank you for watching, and of course, a massive thanks to our wonderful, esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. There's definitely some practical uses for masking, more than I originally thought, so I hope this video helps to give you some ideas, or at least some tricks you can keep in your back pocket. Again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.